The bar was cold. Not cold like Colorado in January, not cold like a swimming pool in September. Cold like something that had never been touched by anything warm in the history of its existence, because it hadn't. The Vethkaran alloy they used for the grip bar in the Coruscant galactic strength trials was manufactured in a foundry orbiting a gas giant 11 light-years from the nearest star, and it had been sitting in a storage crate since the last trial cycle, which was 17 years ago, because that's how long it had been since Earth had a champion qualified to even attempt this event. I stood in front of it, and I thought about my grandfather. His hands were always rougher than they had any right to be. He'd worked construction for 30 years, not the automated kind, the old kind, the kind where you put your back into it and carried things and drove nails until your knuckles stopped bleeding because they'd run out of places to bleed from. When he wrapped his hands around my wrists to show me something, you could feel every decade of it. That hardness. That permanent, baked-in callus that ran from the base of his fingers to the heel of his palm like a second skin that had grown there, because the world required it, and he had obliged. He was not a large man. People who met him later in life, when the construction was behind him and the retirement had softened some of the edges, sometimes seemed surprised by that. In their minds he should have been enormous, should have looked like what he'd done. He was 5'9", medium build, and when he was wearing civilian clothes he looked like a man who might have driven a postal truck for a living. Nothing about him announced itself. Except the hands. "You're not grabbing it," he'd tell me, "you're receiving it." I was 11. I didn't know what that meant. I thought it was something old people said when they wanted to seem wise. I nodded seriously the way you do when someone is teaching you something and you want them to believe you understand, and then I went back to doing it wrong. I was 34 now, standing in the arena of the Coruscant trials, on an asteroid 11 light-years from Colorado, and the meaning of what he'd said had just finished assembling itself inside my chest. The trials happen every 17 years because that's the resonance cycle of the Galactic Arbitration Compact, the treaty that ended the Scouring Wars and replaced territorial combat with formalized physical competition. 17 years, long enough for species to train a new generation of champions, long enough for the wounds from the last cycle to heal, long enough for everyone to forget how badly they lost or how badly they won. The compact had taken 3 centuries to negotiate and another century to stabilize, and the history of it was the kind of history that makes a species humble if they're paying attention and drunk with relief if they're not. The Scouring Wars had been catastrophic on a scale that most humans didn't let themselves fully comprehend, because fully comprehending it required acknowledging how close a species could come to being ended, and how little it would mean to the rest of the universe if they were. The compact was a mechanism, a hard one, carefully balanced, deeply imperfect mechanism, but a mechanism that had held for 300 years because every species party to it had concluded, independently, grudgingly, without enthusiasm, that the mechanism was better than the alternative. Physical competition as territory arbitration was not anyone's first choice, but it was everyone's third or fourth choice, which in a galaxy of competing interests was good enough. Earth had lost. Every single trials cycle we'd participated in, we had lost, not by a little either. The first trials we participated in, Cycle 6, which was 102 years ago, humans sent their best. Olympic weightlifters, strongmen, competitive grapplers, endurance athletes. The Velthar alone had a champion who could press 6,000 kilograms, which is not a number that connects to anything in the ordinary human frame of reference. The Sarek delegates found the sight of human beings trying to compete so genuinely amusing that their delegation posted footage back to their homeworld for entertainment purposes. Earth's athletes finished in the bottom quartile of every event and came home to a welcome that was more muted than the departure had been. Cycle after cycle, the story was the same. We trained harder. We engineered better equipment. We studied the alien physiology reports and tried to build programs around the gaps in our knowledge and theirs. We got better at losing, which is its own kind of progress, the kind that doesn't make the news. By cycle 9, we weren't embarrassing ourselves anymore, but we still weren't winning. The Velthar and the Korathi and the deep-dwelling Kethsorin split the major events between them with the comfortable authority of species that had been doing this for generations. And humanity collected minor placements the way you collect participation ribbons. The gesture of someone who showed up but never truly arrived. And then cycle 12 came, and Marcos Vidal did something. He won the grip retention event. Not by a little. He won it by 11 seconds over the Velthar champion, who had held the record for 2 full cycles and who, by every pre-event analysis and every mid-event projection, was on course to extend it. Marcos Vidal was 31 years old, a former competitive climber from Bilbao who had spent 11 years on sea rescue vessels before the compact office screening program found his metrics, and he had hands like my grandfather. That rough, baked-in, unreasonable hardness. In the interview afterward, the one that went everywhere and was replayed for years, he said his coach had taught him something about how to receive the bar rather than fight it. I remember watching that interview when I was 17. I remember thinking, that's a strange way to put it. I remember the specific cadence of the phrase, the way he said it quietly, like he was describing something almost too ordinary to bother saying out loud. I didn't make the connection for 17 more years. Marcos Vidal retired after cycle 12. Knee surgery, then coaching youth athletes, then a stroke at 62 that left him quiet and slow but not diminished in any way that seemed to matter to him. He wasn't at the trials today. Nobody from cycle 12's team was. That was a long time ago, and this delegation had been assembled from scratch with newer science and newer bodies and methods that had improved on everything except the one thing that turned out to matter most. I was the grip retention representative for Earth, and I was standing in front of the bar, and I had never competed in an interstellar event in my life. My name is Daniel Crow. I'm from Durango, Colorado. I was a wildfire crew supervisor for 11 years, which meant I spent 11 years carrying hoses and hand tools up steep terrain in smoke-choked air with gloves that soaked through in the first hour and stayed wet until the job was done. The load you carry on a fire line is not the organized, properly distributed weight you work with in a gym. It's awkward, shifting, heavier than it looks, designed by no one, adjusted to nothing. You learn to hold things in conditions that don't cooperate. Before that, I was a competition-level arm wrestler. Regional level. Nothing spectacular. The kind of career that earns you trophies and a bad shoulder and some prize money that covers the entry fees if you're lucky, and a little above that if you're good at knowing when to push and when to wait. I was reasonably good at knowing when to push. The shoulder healed eventually. The trophies were in a box in my garage. I had no idea any of this was being observed. The reason I was at the Coruscant trials was because of a screening program Earth's compact office had been running for 6 years, looking for physiological profiles that matched the requirements of specific events. They ran grip strength measurements on a sample pool of 400,000 people across 17 countries. My numbers came back flagged at the regional screening level, were escalated to the national level, were escalated again. Not because I was the strongest. I wasn't, not by any significant margin. There were men and women in that sample pool who could outgrip me at peak output without trying particularly hard. It was the duration metrics, the rate of strength loss over extended hold time, the force curve profile of my grip under sustained load, which was different from what the modeling predicted and different from what any sample in the database showed. Some quality in the mechanics of how I held under pressure that didn't degrade the way it was supposed to. I had never thought about it. It was just the way my hands worked. When the compact office representative reached out, I thought it was a scam. I told them that directly, which I understood afterward was an unusual response, but which the woman on the other end of the line, a compact officer named Yevgenia Solis, received with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before. She explained the program. She explained the screening data. She explained, carefully, that the decision was entirely mine and that declining would not affect my standing with any Earth-based institution. "We'll need you in Geneva in 3 weeks," she said. "We'll cover travel and accommodation. If you don't want to participate after the initial assessment, you can leave at any time." I went to Geneva. I sat in a room and held a calibrated bar for a very long time while people with equipment I didn't recognize wrote down numbers. Then I sat in another room, and a team of people explained to me what those numbers meant in the context of a galactic competition framework, which took most of an afternoon. I didn't leave. The next 14 months were the most rigorous training of my life, not just physical, tactical. The grip retention event in the trials wasn't a simple timed hold. It was a structured endurance challenge with 7 sequential rounds, each one designed around the grip physiology of a different species, each one intended to measure something different from the one before it. Force output at peak, force maintenance under fatigue, adjustment capacity under shifting load distribution, recovery speed between rounds, stability under induced vibration, the trade-offs between grip depth and grip width. And the final round, a long, silent, grinding hold where nothing changed except everything slowly got heavier, one mechanism click at a time, until someone's hands decided they were done. I learned more about alien anatomy in those 14 months than I had absorbed in the previous 3 decades of being alive on a planet aware of the galaxy. The Velthar, who had dominated this event for cycles, had forearm musculature that operated on a different mechanical principle than human arms, longer lever ratios, cooler baseline tissue temperature, a neural firing pattern that was measurably more efficient under sustained load. They were not stronger than humans in the way the word usually means. They were better at holding for longer under specific conditions, in the way that a geological formation is better at standing than a tree is. The Korathi were different again, shorter, wider, with grip architecture that favored force distribution over raw output. Good for round 6. The Kethsorin were cave dwellers whose hands had evolved in environments that required sustained grip under vibration and uncertainty, patient in a way that felt structural. I learned all of this. I trained against simulations built from all of this. And then one evening, 6 weeks before the shuttle left, I was watching old footage on my phone. Home footage from my grandfather's house, the grainy digital kind from when digital was new, the footage you didn't think of as archival at the time, and then suddenly it was all you had. I was watching a morning in my grandfather's yard. I was 11 in the footage, struggling, complaining about something I couldn't hear anymore because the audio had degraded. My grandfather was patient. He kept moving my hands, adjusting the angle, pressing his thumb against the base of my fingers to show me where the pressure should sit. "Stop fighting it," he said, audible even through the degraded audio. "Receive it." I paused the video. The room was quiet. The footage sat still on the screen, my grandfather's hands around my 11-year-old hands, showing me something he'd spent 30 years learning. I thought about the force curve data from my assessments, the specific profile that the compact office's analysts had flagged as anomalous, the thing that was different about how I held under sustained load that they hadn't been able to fully explain using the models they had. I picked up my phone and called Yevgenia Solis. "I need to change the training program," I said when she answered. "Not all of it, the last 6 weeks." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to add?" "Nothing," I said. "I want to stop practicing the technique and start practicing understanding it." Another pause. "What's the difference?" "I'll tell you if it works," I said. The Coruscant station orbited a blue dwarf star that cast everything in cold light. The asteroid itself was larger than it looked from the shuttle. The habitable interior was enormous, carved and finished over centuries into something that felt permanent in a way that most human construction didn't. The kind of permanent that comes from not expecting anyone to ever need to do this again, because this has always been here and always will be. The arena was the central chamber. It could accommodate the viewing delegations of 12 species simultaneously without anyone being crowded, which meant it felt cavernous to the 4 or 5 delegations that were actually present for any given event. The ceiling was high enough that the upper section disappeared into temperature-controlled atmospheric haze. The lighting was the station's standard blue-tinted full spectrum, overlaid with the warmer tones of the competition floor rigs. I spent the first 3 days watching, getting a feel for the environment, the crowd patterns, the way the alien delegations moved through the station's common spaces. The Velthar were the loudest, not in volume, which they didn't express the way humans did, but in presence. They occupied space in a particular way. The word I keep reaching for is unhurried. They moved the way entities move when they're not running any calculations about outcomes because the outcomes are not in question. The Korathi were quieter but more watchful. They'd placed in grip retention before, not at the top, but consistently enough to be noticed and tracked. Their champion this cycle was younger than I expected, approximately the equivalent of our early 20s, built low and wide, with forearms that seemed proportionally too long for her body in a way that made sense once you understood the mechanical advantage she was working with. She had the same quality the Velthar had, the unhurried quality, but in her it felt earned rather than assumed. Like she'd worked for her certainty and knew exactly what it had cost. Then there was Senentai of the Kethsorin. He barely moved. When he did move, it was slow and deliberate, like he was managing a resource that needed to last longer than the current moment. The Kethsorin registered quiet differently from everyone else in the arena. Their quiet had texture. It felt inhabited. And there was Preth. Cornelius Preth, he'd gone by Preth so long I don't think the Cornelius was functional anymore, had been Earth's compact liaison for 9 years. He was a small, careful, precise man who dressed like he was perpetually about to testify before a committee. He wore the formality lightly, which is harder than it sounds. He'd briefed me in Geneva. He'd briefed me again on the shuttle. He'd briefed me a 3rd time on the station, in a sitting room off the main delegation quarters, with tea that was close to the kind of tea you get on Earth but not quite. The briefings weren't the problem. The problem was a thing Yevgenia Solis had told me quietly, 11 days before the shuttle launched, in a hallway in Geneva that she'd clearly chosen for being empty. "Watch Preth," she said. "Not like a suspect. I'm not asking you to gather evidence or confirm anything. Just be aware of him. Watch where his attention goes." I asked her what she meant. "The Compact Office did an internal review 2 years ago," she said, "looking at why we placed so poorly in cycles 10 and 11 despite preparation. That was objectively better than cycle 9's. There were anomalies in the tactical data that got filed before those cycles, gaps in the intelligence summaries, missing footage from Velthar preparation sessions that Preth had been given access to as part of his liaison role. Pages of analysis that existed in draft form and didn't make it into the final briefs." She paused. "The review concluded that the gaps were consistent with selective omission, not deletion, omission, which is harder to prove and easier to deny." "What's his arrangement?" I asked. "That's what the review couldn't establish," she said. "But the circumstantial pattern was clear enough to flag. The Velthar have very good intelligence on human physiological profiles, better than our sharing agreements with them should account for." I thought about that for a moment, and he knows he's been flagged. He knows there was a review, he doesn't know what it concluded. She looked at me steadily. "Go compete, Daniel. The flag is ours to manage. What I need from you is just awareness. If something doesn't sit right, trust that and tell me." I watched Preth for 3 days. He was polite, attentive, deeply, carefully helpful in ways that were never quite useful, the kind of helpfulness that is performed for the record, the kind that can be pointed to later as evidence of good faith. He had a quality that I recognized from certain managers I'd had on fire lines, the quality of a person who has already decided how things are going to go and is simply maintaining the narrative until events confirm it. The night before day 4, he stopped by my preparation quarters. He had a report in a flat document sleeve. The Velthar champions recorded grip metrics from the first 3 days of competition, showing Corvith Shanalai in extraordinary form. The gap may be unclosable, Preth said. His expression was the expression of a man delivering difficult news with compassionate professionalism. The compact office wants you to know they consider any placement an achievement at this stage. You should feel no pressure to exceed expectations that were, frankly, set quite high. I thanked him. After he left, I set the report aside without reading it. Then I called Yevgenia. He came by, I said. With what? A performance report on Corvith, framed as helpful, telling me the gap was unclosable. A long pause. What did you do with it? I didn't read it. Another pause. Then get some sleep, Daniel. Day 4 arrived like every other day on the station, without ceremony, the lights shifting from dim to standard bright on a schedule that had nothing to do with any sun I'd ever lived under. I ate. I stretched. I sat quietly for 20 minutes and went through a sequence my grandfather had taught me that I'd spent years thinking was just a breathing exercise and had eventually understood was a method for settling the hands. You breathe out longer than you breathe in. You let your fingers extend until they're not reaching for anything. You stop fighting the air. It sounds simple. The simple version takes maybe 30 seconds. The real version, the version where the settling is actual and not performed, takes as long as it takes, and the only way to know the difference is that when it's real, you stop monitoring whether it's happening. That morning it took 14 minutes. When I stood up, my hands felt like they were mine in a different way than they usually did. Not stronger, not changed, just present. The arena for grip retention was a secondary chamber off the main competition floor, which meant the crowd was compressed, the same number of delegates in a smaller space, which affected the acoustics in interesting ways. You could hear things in that chamber that the main floor's volume would have swallowed. The sound of the bar mechanism cycling, the particular frequency of the environmental systems, the subtle breathing patterns of 6 alien species arranged in concentric delegation galleries. And you could hear the silence that fell when my registration appeared on the display board. 7 competitors, 1 from each qualifying species. I was the only human. That wasn't unusual. Earth only qualified for specific events, and we'd been scrambling for placements in those events for as long as the compact had applied to us. What was unusual was the duration of the silence and what it was made of. Not indifference, not the absence of something, the presence of recalibration. 17 years, cycle 12, the record. The Velthar section had a particular sound after the silence, brief, tonal, rising at the end. I didn't have a precise translation, but the cadence was clear enough. It was the cadence of people who have looked at something they were expecting to dismiss and found the situation less dismissible than anticipated. Not concern, pre-concern, the preliminary awareness of concern. Corvith Shanalai glanced at me once. His eyes were the pale yellow of cold suns. He had the kind of face that doesn't organize itself around emotion the way human faces do, not blank, not controlled, but structured differently, the expressions working through different channels. He looked at me and he processed what he saw, and then he looked away, and what his looking away meant I couldn't read cleanly, but it wasn't dismissal. He was not dismissing me. That in itself was something. The first round began. The bar was mounted on a sensor rig that measured grip force at 20 individual points across its surface, using a technology I had studied and still only partially understood. You wrapped your hands around it, and the sensors read the distribution and magnitude of your hold in real time, and the readings appeared on a display visible to the judges, and to a secondary display in the gallery where the delegations could follow the scoring. The event had a 30-second setup period at the start of each round where you found your position. Then the timer started, and you held until you couldn't, and both the hold duration and the force curve data were scored against species-specific baselines and combined into a cumulative matrix. The bar was cold. I wrapped my hands around it. I stopped fighting the air. Round 1 was the shortest of the 7 baseline testing, all contestants on their bars simultaneously, measuring peak force output at the start before any fatigue had accumulated. No one expected variation in round 1. You gripped as hard as you could and held it as cleanly as you could, and the data went into the scoring matrix. I finished with the third highest peak force in the round. The Velthar were first and second, Corvith leading, the second Velthar representative close behind. The Korathi girl was fourth. Senentai of the Kethsorin was fifth. The display board updated. The numbers rearranged. In the delegation galleries, something shifted in the quality of attention. Third was not a result anyone had predicted for Earth in this event. I did not celebrate it. Third in round 1, with 6 rounds remaining, was data. It was information about where I was. It was not information about where I would finish. Round 2 was the adjustment round. The bar moved, not dramatically, no sudden jarring shifts, just small lateral displacements that changed the distribution of force across your grip over the course of the hold. The challenge was accommodation. Your grip had to adjust in real time without losing overall force output, and the adjustment had to be smooth enough that the force curve didn't show significant degradation during transition. Species with rigid grip structures, species whose peak performance depended on a fixed, locked-in position, lost points here. The Velthar were not rigid exactly, but their adaptation range was narrower than their peak output suggested. Corvith dropped 3 points on his percentage. The second Velthar dropped more. I had drilled this round more than any other, not because I was particularly confident in my adjustment capacity, but because the data from my assessments showed that this was where the gap between my performance and the Velthar's performance was smallest. If I was going to find ground, I'd find it here. I found it. Not dramatically. The adjustment capacity I had wasn't flashy. It didn't show up as one big recalibration, but as a continuous, low-level responsiveness that kept the force curve unusually flat across the transitions. On the display board, the difference looked like nothing. In the cumulative matrix, it compounded. Third again after round 2, Corvith still leading, extending his margin over the second-place Velthar. The Korathi girl had moved from 4th to 3rd, which meant I'd moved from 3rd to 4th. I noted this and did not react. Rounds 3 and 4 were fatigue rounds, extended sustained holds with increasing baseline tension, designed to measure how strength output decayed over time. This was where the scoring traditionally compressed, and where species with better fatigue resistance pulled away from the field. Mine was unusually low. Not dramatically, not by the kind of number that jumps off the display and demands explanation. But the analysts in the gallery were watching the fatigue decay coefficients for each competitor, and at some point in the second minute of round 3, a figure appeared next to my name in a secondary column that hadn't updated for 17 years. I didn't see the crowd react because I was watching the bar. But I felt it, the particular redistribution of attention that a room makes when it stops being certain about something. In competition, any competition, human or alien, there is a moment when the expected outcome becomes uncertain, and the energy in the space changes. I'd felt it in arm wrestling at the regional level, the moment you realize the match you thought you had figured out has a different ending than the one you were managing toward. I'd felt it on fire lines when a containable burn turned into something else entirely, because the conditions changed faster than the projections had. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's a quality of attention that shifts from settled to unsettled, from observed to watching. After round 4, the cumulative scoring matrix showed Corvith Shanalai in first, Senentai of the Kethsorin, who had been quietly accumulating points in every round with the methodical patience of something geological, in second, Daniel Crow of Earth in third. Third place, after 4 rounds for Earth. The last time Earth had finished in the top half of this event's field after 4 rounds was Cycle 9, 40 years ago. Top 3, after 4 rounds. The Earth delegation in the observer gallery apparently experienced this as significant. I learned later that Yevgenia was gripping the railing in front of her seat hard enough that she had bruises the next day, which she described as the best bruises she'd ever had. Preth, seated 3 rows behind her, had leaned forward after round 3 and said something to the Velthar diplomatic liaison seated ahead of him. She wrote it down as a flag. Round 5 was the stability round. Induced vibration in the bar, low-frequency oscillations designed to destabilize certain grip styles more than others. The Kethsorin had evolved in cave environments with exactly this kind of ambient vibration, and Senentai moved from second to first in round 5. Corvith dropped 4 points on his cumulative score, not dramatically, but visibly, the Velthar's primary weakness in this event showing its contours. I lost 3 points, which was less than expected. The Korathi girl lost 2. She was better at this than anyone had projected, and she knew it. Something in her posture after round 5 had a satisfaction in it that had nothing to do with how the rest of the field was doing. Updated standings after 5 rounds. Senentai of the Kethsorin in first, Corvith Shanalai of the Velthar in second, Daniel Crow of Earth in third. Third, still third, with 2 rounds remaining. The Velthar section was very quiet. Corvith had not looked at me again since the beginning. He was looking at me now. Round 6 was the force-depth versus force-width round. The bar physically reconfigured its grip surface, an actual geometric adjustment, the diameter and texture changing based on competitor-specific calibration data filed before the trials. Each contestant's bar was set to a configuration intended to match their physiological optimum. The theory was that this round removed the equipment variable and measured pure grip output at each competitor's ideal setting. The configuration for my bar was wrong. I figured this out in the first 40 seconds of the round. The grip width was set 4 mm narrower than my assessment data indicated as optimal, 4 mm, which sounds trivial until you understand that in a precision grip endurance context, 4 mm changes the load distribution across the palm in a way that shifts the primary force transfer point from the basal metacarpal junction, where my strength reservoir sat deepest, forward toward the proximal interphalangeal joints, which are capable of generating force, but not of sustaining it at the same rate or duration. In practical terms, the bar was loading my fingers instead of my palm, the wrong place. I had used my 30-second setup window. The round had begun. I could adjust mid-hold, repositioning was legal. There were no restrictions on moving your hands as long as contact was maintained. But adjusting mid-hold generated a visible anomaly in the force curve data, a dip, scored against you. I thought about Preth. I thought about a 4 mm error in a configuration that was supposed to be filed by the Compact's technical staff based on data that our delegation provided. I thought about who had provided that data and through what chain. I thought about Yevgenia saying watch him, not like a suspect. I took the load in the wrong position, and I held it anyway. There is something that happens when you stop being able to rely on your mechanics. When the position is wrong and you know it's wrong and you can't fix it without a cost you can't afford, you can panic, try to manage the wrong position as if better management will make it right. Or you can stop managing entirely and simply carry what you're carrying with whatever you have left. My grandfather had spent 30 years carrying things in wrong positions. Concrete that wouldn't cooperate, loads that shifted, weather that changed everything. He didn't talk about it much, but the results were in his hands, in the way the strength had distributed itself across the full architecture of his grip, because it had never been allowed to concentrate in just the convenient places. The inconvenient places had been called on, and they had answered, and eventually they became reliable. I received the load. Not as a decision, as a recognition. Round 6 ended. My score was lower than it should have been. The force curve showed the anomaly clearly. The distribution weighted wrong from the start. The dip in the middle where I was compensating. The recovery in the final third when whatever was wrong had been absorbed and accepted. Points deducted. The judges' display updated. Updated standings after 6 rounds. Corvith Shanalai back in first. He'd found something in round 6, some compensation for the stability round losses, pushing himself back to the lead with a performance that the Velthar gallery registered with something that sounded like exhaled relief. Senentai in second. Daniel Crow in third. Still third. Still. I stood at the bar and I didn't move. There is a quality of tiredness that goes past the body into somewhere else entirely. I had been standing in a grip retention event for an extended and documented period of time, and all of the physical things that were happening in my hands and arms and shoulders were happening, and they were real and they mattered, and they would have consequences that I would feel for several days. But in that moment between rounds 6 and 7, the tiredness had reached whatever is underneath the physical, and what I found there was not weakness. What I found was simple. The record was 8 minutes and 31 seconds. Marcos Vidal, cycle 12, 17 years ago. Round 7 was the final round, the long hold, and it was the only round that had ever produced a record. The round was a sustained hold at a baseline weight that increased by 5 kilograms every 30 seconds, the increment triggered automatically by the mechanism, each click adding to the load until someone's grip gave out and their score locked. No adjustments permitted, no repositioning, just you and the bar and the accumulating weight and the question of when your hands decided they were finished. The mechanism clicks at 30-second intervals. 8 minutes 31 seconds is 17 clicks past the start. I wrapped my hands around the bar. I breathed out longer than I breathed in. I received it. The field thinned steadily across the first 3 minutes. The Korathi girl lasted to 4 minutes 40 seconds, remarkable, a personal best, a species best if the scoring records were to be believed, and when she released the bar she stood completely straight and did not look defeated and did not look relieved. She looked like someone who had found a new edge and made a note of exactly where it was. That was all. She stepped back and she was done with the round, and the round was done with her, and she was satisfied with the accounting. At 5 minutes 12 seconds, both remaining Velthar competitors released within 40 seconds of each other. The second one, Corvith's compatriot, had been carrying a shoulder issue visible in the tension of his posture since round 4, and his release had a quality of relief in it. Corvith Shanalai did not release. At 6 minutes 12 seconds, Senentai of the Kethsorin released. He held as long as the geological patience in him could sustain, and when it was done, it was genuinely done, not a competition decision, not a tactical choice, simply the completion of his capacity. When he let go, he looked at me. Not a challenge, not an evaluation, the look of one stubborn thing acknowledging another stubborn thing. 7 minutes. The bar was at a weight I had never held in training. My forearms were in the place past burning where the body stops sending specific signals because the signals aren't helping anymore. I knew what was happening in the tissue. The knowing was noted and set aside. Corvith was still holding. He was magnificent. I have said this before and I mean it without qualification. Whatever happened before, whatever I suspected and couldn't prove, Corvus Shanalai was a competitor in the way that the word means something real and earned. He had held this bar across 3 trial cycles. He had held it longer than any other living creature. He was holding it now with everything the structure of him could give, and what that structure could give was extraordinary. He was looking at me steadily, not as a competitor assessing threat, something else, something that had moved past competition into a different kind of attention, the attention you give to something you want to understand because understanding it matters more than defeating it. 7 minutes 30. The record was 8:31. I thought about my grandfather's yard, about a boy who didn't understand something and a man who had enough patience to try to give it to him anyway, not because it would be understood immediately, but because it might be understood eventually, and eventually was good enough. I thought about 11 light years, about the specific cold of this bar, about Yevgenia in Geneva saying the screening program had been running for 6 years looking for a physiological profile they couldn't find a name for, and finding it in a wildfire supervisor from Colorado. I thought about Marcos Vidal, 31 years old, from Bilbao, saying quietly in an interview that went everywhere that his coach had taught him something about how to receive the bar rather than fight it. I thought about the word receive, what it means in English, what it must mean in Spanish for a climber who grew up on rock faces in the Basque Country, what it means in the body when the body finally stops negotiating and starts simply being the thing that holds. 8 minutes. The mechanism clicked. Heavier. I breathed out. 8 minutes 31 seconds is when Marcos Vidal's record was set, 17 years ago. 8 minutes 32 seconds is when, for the first time in 17 years, someone was still holding after the record fell. I did not know this had happened in the moment because I was not watching the clock. I was watching nothing. I had closed my eyes sometime in the 7th minute, not from pain, not from effort, but because the information in the room had become irrelevant, and the only information that mattered was in the contact between my hands and the bar, and the weight of 17 years of mathematics, proving that this was the place where Earth ran out. What I knew at 8 minutes 32 seconds was that I was still holding. What I did not know was what the arena sounded like. Yevgenia told me later. She was crying and had been crying since 8 minutes and couldn't stop, which she described as extremely unprofessional and completely worth it. The Velthar delegation, she said, was silent in a way that was different from their ordinary confidence. The silence of a room that had been told something it wasn't sure it knew what to do with. The Korathi girl was standing at the gallery, railing with her hands on it, and her body leaning forward in a way that Yevgenia said reminded her of someone watching the sea. Senentai of the Kethurin had his eyes closed. Preth was not watching the bar. Preth was watching Yevgenia. 8 minutes 45, 9 minutes, 9 minutes 30. Corvus's grip gave at 9 minutes 53 seconds. The sound he made was not defeat. I want to be clear about this. I heard it, I was close enough, and it was not the sound of losing. It was the sound of completion, of a thing fully spent. He had given everything the architecture of his body was capable of giving, and the moment his hands released the bar was the moment he had genuinely reached the end of what was possible for him, and there was a particular dignity in that. Something almost clean. He stepped back from the bar. He looked at me for a long time, long enough that it registered in the room, long enough that people noticed. Then he made a gesture with his right hand. I learned later that it was Velthar for something that translates approximately as, the weight found the right place to fall. I held for another 74 seconds. Not because I needed to, not to demonstrate anything. The mechanism only stops when the weight exceeds the theoretical physiological maximum for any known species, and the protocol was to hold until release or mechanism stop, and I had enough left to hold, so I held. At 11 minutes 7 seconds the mechanism reached a threshold weight and stopped automatically, and I held for another 3 seconds to make sure I was releasing by choice and not by failure, and then I let go. My hands felt like they belonged to someone else, someone very tired who had done something significant. The arena was loud for a while, not in ways I could fully interpret. I stood at the bar and let it be loud around me and waited until it had said whatever it needed to say. The scoring had me in first place. Earth's first victory in the grip retention event since cycle 12. A new record by 1 minute 34 seconds. The largest margin of victory in the event's recorded history. The formal certification took 40 minutes. I spent most of it in the preparation room with a medical team checking my hands, intact, moderately swollen, nothing structural, nothing that rest and time and some specific treatment wouldn't address. And with Yevgenia Solis, who had come down from the gallery and who looked like someone who had been crying for a while and didn't particularly care if it showed. 6 years, she said. I know, I said. I told people for 6 years that the physiological profile existed, and we just hadn't found it yet, and they kept telling me we'd looked everywhere and maybe this wasn't the event for us. You found it, I said. She looked at me for a moment. You had it. Preth was not present for the celebration. He had been in a meeting with compact compliance officers since approximately the midpoint of round 7, which was when Yevgenia had submitted a formal anomaly report about the configuration discrepancy on my bar in round 6, 4 millimeters. The compliance process was its own machinery, slow and procedural and thorough. I was not part of it. I didn't follow it afterward. That was someone else's work. The trials continued for 5 more days. Earth didn't win another event. We got a 4th in the long-duration cardiovascular round, a 5th in 2 others. The final aggregate was our best performance since cycle 9, by a significant margin. It's not a winning score overall. I want to be honest about that. One record in one event doesn't restructure the architecture of a century of results. The Velthar still led the aggregate. The Korathi were consistent. The Kethsorin accumulated points with the patience of something that has decided to be thorough about it. But something had shifted, not in the numbers, in the room. I know this because of a thing that happened on the last day of the trials, in one of the corridors that connected the secondary preparation areas to the main thoroughfare. I was walking back from the final event ceremony, alone, moving at a pace my hands still required me to move at. Senenta of the Kethsorin came around the corner ahead of me, and we both stopped. He was taller than he seemed from the competition floor. The corridor lighting, the station's standard blue-tinted spectrum, did something to the pigmentation of his skin that I hadn't noticed before. In that light he was almost translucent, the way things that have evolved deep in the earth away from any sun are translucent. His eyes were dark and warm in a way that contradicted the coolness of everything else about him. Stone that has been underground long enough to carry what the underground carries. He looked at me. Then he held up his right hand just slightly, the gesture minimal, nothing performative, and he spread his fingers in the particular way you spread them when you're showing someone something about how you hold. Not holding, showing. I held up my right hand and did the same. He made a sound I didn't have a word for. Low, brief, resonant, not dismissive, not amused. The sound of one stubborn thing recognizing another. Then he went around me and continued down the corridor. I stood there for a moment. I received it. 3 months later, back in Durango, I went to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried. Not the day I got back. I needed some ordinary time between there and here, some days that were just days, to let the extraordinary settle into something I could hold steadily without it changing shape every time I looked at it. He'd been in the ground for 12 years. The headstone was the simple kind he would have wanted. His name, the dates, a short line from a psalm he'd liked that said something about the work of our hands being established, which I'd thought was a builder's sentiment when we chose it and thought was something more now. I stood there for a while. The wind was doing its Colorado thing, not violent, just present, the kind of wind that lets you know the landscape has opinions. I don't know what you say at a grave that covers something you owe someone. I don't think there's a formula, and even if there was one, I don't think he would have wanted it. He was not a formula kind of person. I used it, I said, eventually. The thing you taught me. In a room 11 light years from here, in front of 6 species I don't have words for and a bar made of something that doesn't exist on this planet, against a competitor who'd held the record for 3 cycles. I used the thing you taught me when I was 11. The wind came through. I didn't know I had it for a long time, I said. That's the thing. You put it in my hands too early for me to know it was there, and I spent 23 years not knowing I was carrying it, and then I needed it. I stood there until I didn't have more to say. Then I said, I'm going to teach it. Yevgenia called 6 weeks after I got home. She didn't ask directly. She waited, the way careful people do when they want the answer to be genuinely the person's own and not a response to pressure. 17 years is a long time, I said. Yes, she said. It's also exactly long enough to train someone from the beginning. She was quiet for a moment. What does that mean? There are kids out there with the right profile, I said. Kids who are maybe 10, 11, 12, too young to know what they have. If we find them and start now, they'll be the right age for cycle 14. The compact office would need to authorize an expanded screening program at younger age cohorts. That's a significant proposal. Then propose it. A long pause. You'd coach, she said. I'd teach, I said. There's a difference. She didn't ask what the difference was. Maybe she understood. Maybe she'd figure it out eventually. The difference is what my grandfather understood, that teaching something is not the same as transferring a technique. You can transfer a technique. Techniques can be described and copied and practiced and reproduced. What my grandfather gave me was not a technique. It was an understanding, a way of being in contact with weight. Something so simple it takes decades to absorb, and something so specific that the body that absorbs it doesn't know it has it until the moment it's needed. He put it in my hands when I was 11. I held it for 23 years without knowing. And then I needed it, 11 light years from home, with the weight increasing every 30 seconds, and it was there. Not as a memory I was reaching for or a technique I was executing, but as something that had become part of the architecture of how I hold things. That is what I will teach. Not the grip, the receiving. Find them young enough that they don't know they're being given something. Be patient. Show them where the pressure should sit. Tell them to stop fighting it and show them what that means with your hands when the words aren't enough, and trust that if you show them early enough and clearly enough and patiently enough, they'll carry it. They won't know they're carrying it until they need it, and then it will be there. Received, held. Passed forward. 17 years from now, on a bar made of alien alloy in a chamber carved from an asteroid, some kid from somewhere on this planet is going to wrap their hands around something cold and unexpected and difficult, and somewhere in the specific way they hold it, in the deep base of the grip, where the strength sits without announcing itself, there will be something I put there, and something my grandfather put there before me, and it will not be a technique or a record or a strategy. It will be a way of being in contact with weight. Simple as that. Simple as that. There is something I haven't said about the 2 weeks between the grip retention event and the end of the trials. The celebration, the medical review, the formal certification, those things happened in a rush in the immediate aftermath, and I've described them because they were part of the sequence. But there was a different texture to the days that followed, and I think it matters. The other athletes knew what had happened. All of them, from every delegation. Word in a closed environment like the Coruscant station travels differently than it travels in open space. There are fewer distractions, fewer layers, and the social geometries of 12 species compressed into a shared facility produce a kind of information saturation that is both useful and exhausting. Within hours of the event result being certified, every competitor in the trials knew the name Daniel Crow and what had happened with the grip retention record. What surprised me was how they responded. Not with hostility, which I'd have understood. Not with the kind of careful diplomatic neutrality that species extend to each other in formal competitive contexts when they want to avoid acknowledging something inconvenient. What I got from most of them, in ways I didn't have the cultural vocabulary to fully read, but that communicated clearly enough through the body language of physical beings, was something closer to interest. Athletes understand something about other athletes that non-athletes sometimes miss. They understand that a performance at the edge of what's possible is a kind of information, regardless of who produces it. When someone does something that the current understanding of things said couldn't be done, the response among people who do hard things isn't usually resentment. It's closer to hunger, the need to know how, the recognition that the understanding they've been working within was incomplete, and the incompleteness has just been demonstrated, and now they need to revise. I had conversations in corridors and dining areas, and the common exercise spaces that I didn't expect to have. A Korathi technician who turned out to be an analyst for their grip retention program sat with me for an hour and asked questions I couldn't always answer about the force distribution pattern in my round 7 data. A Velthar junior athlete, young, not competing this cycle, watched me do my post-event hand therapy and then asked, through the translation system, how long I had trained. When I told him 14 months, he was still for a moment. Then he asked something that the translation system rendered as, what had been in your hands before the 14 months? I thought about that for a long time before I answered. 30 years, I said. But not mine. He didn't have a context for that, and I didn't have the language to give him one. So we sat with the limitation of the translation system and left it there. But he kept watching, and his watching had the quality I'd come to recognize, the appetite of someone who has identified something they need to understand. I found myself thinking about what my grandfather would have made of this, of all of it, the station, the aliens, the event, the record. He was not a man given to speculation about the distant future. His orientation was practical, grounded in the immediate and the achievable. But he had a quality that I think would have served him well here. He was genuinely interested in how other people held things, not metaphorically, literally. He would notice how someone gripped a tool or a rope or a bar, and he would have thoughts about it that he might or might not share. And if he shared them, it was always with the directness of someone who believed that better technique was worth talking about, and pride in existing technique was not a good reason to avoid improvement. He would have found Corvith's grip interesting. He would have found Senentai's grip extraordinary. He would have sat with the Korathi analyst and had a conversation that required no translation system because the things they cared about were the same things, and the body understands more than the mouth can explain. He would have been, I think, immediately at home in a room full of species comparing notes on how to hold weight without giving out. I carry him differently now than I did before the trials. I've carried him for 12 years since the stroke took him, and the carrying has changed over time the way grief changes, not diminishing exactly, but redistributing, settling into something that is part of the structure rather than sitting on top of it. What the trials did was clarify something about what I'm carrying. It was never just the man. It was the knowledge he put in my hands when I was 11, and the 23 years I held it without knowing, and the single hour in a chamber 11 light years from home when the knowledge finally spoke. What I carry now is the continuity. The proof that something passed from his hands to mine, and from his hands and mine to a scoreboard in an asteroid, and from that scoreboard to a room full of species, reconsidering what they thought they knew about a world 11 light years away. He built things that are still standing. He drove nails that are still holding. He spent 30 years learning how to carry weight without giving out, and then he taught me the version of it that lives in the hands, not the back, and the version in the hands turned out to travel farther than the buildings. I don't know if he would have had words for that. He wasn't a man who reached for words when he didn't need them, but I think he would have recognized it. The way a builder recognizes good work, not with enthusiasm, because enthusiasm is for people who are surprised, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew what they were putting in and is not surprised that it held. The work of our hands. Established. The shuttle home left on the 10th day. I was on it with the rest of the Earth delegation, plus Yevgenia and 3 compact office staff who had stayed to manage the compliance review. Preth was not on it. Preth's return travel arrangements had become someone else's problem, and the details of that were not shared with me, and I did not ask. The transit time between the Coruscant station and Earth's nearest relay hub was 6 days. 6 days in a ship that was comfortable enough but finite in its spaces and activities. I slept. I ate. I did the hand therapy protocols the medical team had given me, twice a day, which were tedious and effective. I talked to Yevgenia about the expanded screening proposal and what it would require and what the timeline would look like and which age cohorts would be the priority. 11, I said, start at 11. She raised an eyebrow. Or younger, I said, but 11 is the age where the foundation sets. My grandfather started with me at 11. The grip strength numbers won't mean anything yet. That's not what you're measuring. What are we measuring? I thought about how to explain it in terms the program could work with, in terms that would make sense to analysts building a screening framework. You're looking for children who, when given a sustained load they can't easily manage, stop fighting it before you tell them to, I said. Not because they're giving up, because they've found something else. You can see it in the force curve if you know what you're looking for. The curve doesn't drop, it shifts. The load redistributes. Yevgenia wrote something down. We'll need to build new assessment tools, she said. Yes, I said. That's 18 months minimum. Then start 18 months ago, I said. She looked at me. We have 17 years, I said. 17 years is exactly long enough, but only if we start now. She nodded slowly. The nodding had the quality of something decided. Outside the viewport, the stars were the specific brilliant indifference they always are when you're far enough from anything that light doesn't scatter. 11 light years is nothing on the scale of what's out there. 11 light years is a breath, a pause between words, the distance between what you understood and what you're beginning to understand. I put my hand flat on the viewport. The metal was cold. I received it.